And up next, we have Sohrab Salimi. And Sohrab, I'm going to spotlight you just so everybody can be drawn to your image and there you go.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Here we have Sohrab. Take it away, Sohrab.
Well, wonderful. Thank you, Michael. And hello, everyone. It's I heard it's 1:15 over there in New York where Michael is. It's 7:15 p.m. where I am in Germany. And it would be interesting to see from where people are joining. And you might have done that in the previous session, but as far as I know, people also switch from tracks to tracks. And I was not there in the previous session, so feel free to type in the country, the city, whatever. I see there are some other people from Europe as well. Oh, there's even someone from Tehran, Iran. That's the place where I was born. So good to see you all participating in this session. Now, usually these kind of sessions start quickly by introducing the speaker or the speaker introducing themselves. I will also immediately share my LinkedIn profile. So if you're interested in connecting or following, whatever works for you, feel free to do that. Now, who am I? My name is Sohrab Salimi, as Michael already said. I was born in Iran, moved to Germany at the age of 4, grew up here, ultimately ended up studying medicine. Yes, you heard that right. I'm the only medical doctor in the Agile space who has the highest level of accreditations, being a certified Scrum trainer, a certified Agile leadership educator with the Scrum Alliance. I've been working in this space now for over 12 years, but my journey did not go from medicine directly into this area. Actually, right after graduating from med school, I also did a stint in the US at the University of Minnesota. I decided to try something else. So I joined Bain & Company, a big strategy consulting firm, and I stayed there for about 3 years. After finally, my wife said, as long as you're staying there, we're not going to have any kids. And as I always wanted to have kids, I said, all right, then I have to leave. And also the learning curve is flattening. So let's explore something new. And the problem back then was I was traveling way too much. So I decided to still continue working a lot, becoming an entrepreneur, but actually not traveling that much. Now, later, when I started giving these kind of trainings, again, I had a lot of requests from companies all over the world. So I did more of a travel than initially planned. And thanks to COVID, there were some good aspects to it as well. It's all virtual now. So I can run my trainings virtual. I can speak at conferences virtual. I can participate at conferences that happen at different time zones. So that's wonderful. And I'm super, super happy to be here. It's always different to be in the same room with people, but I think this is much better than not seeing each other. And at the same time, I try to bring the in-person flavor using a flip chart into the virtual world. So there will be more than just the title of the session on this flip chart. I will actually be doing some drawings there as well. And I want to also acknowledge Jimmy's talk earlier. When I didn't see the whole session, but when I joined, I was hearing so many familiar messages. So it might be sounding like a broken record when you hear me speak, because Jimmy and I share a lot of the same experiences. Although we've never met each other, but I've seen his work. I work closely with some of the people at CRISP, where Jimmy used to work or still works. I don't know. He can correct me on that. And there will be some redundancies out there. But I think repetition makes actually the learning stick. So what is today's topic? Today's topic is how sustainable enablement is the foundation of successful transformation. Now, a ton of fancy words in there, and I promise I will break this down for you. Now, what I see mostly happening is an organization decides to become more agile. And every organization seems to have very different definitions of what that is. For one organization, and some of you asked Jimmy earlier, like, how can I convince managers to do this, right? Where are how can I come up with an ROI, or what are the KPIs to track? It could be creating more revenue for the organization because they're seeing that the existing product portfolio is not accelerate or not growing as fast as they like, or it's actually declining. It could be identifying faster ways to deliver value to customers, to increase customer satisfaction, and through that, for example, customer lifetime value. It could be speeding up the time to market so that you can test more frequently whether your product ideas are actually working. It can be many, many things. It could also be, we want to increase employee satisfaction. That's also a valid approach or goal or target in terms of becoming more agile. But what most organizations then do is they get someone in, maybe someone like me or other consultants and coaches. And one word that I hear a lot in these organizations, especially when we talk about leadership, is, oh, you just need to empower your people, right? Just empower them. I mean, there's a whole book around that topic from Marty Kagan, and that book is called Empowered. Now, anybody who reads that book, and you can actually see it behind me in the bookshelf, right? Anybody who reads that book realizes that the book Empowered is not only about empowering people. Ultimately, it results in empowering people, but initially it starts with something else. Now, before I dive into this and some other concepts, I'd like to first establish a definition of agility, at least something that I use and that I found, or that many of my clients, I've taught over 10,000 people in the past decade, that many of my clients find very, very useful. And that definition is fairly simple. Many of you might be familiar with this diagram from Stacy, right? The Stacy model or Stacy diagram, where we have uncertainty in terms of what, increasing from the left to the right, and uncertainty in terms of how, increasing from the bottom to the top. And based on these two axes, Stacy distinguishes 4 different domains of work. Very little uncertainty in terms of how and what, simple domain. A bit more uncertainty, complicated domain. Even more uncertainty, complex domain. And at the very top, high levels of uncertainty in terms of what to do and how to do things is the chaos domain. Now, this might be new to most of you. This might be already there for most of you, not new. Now, the intention of agility for me, or the empirical approach to work, is always the following. We want to frequently and systematically reduce uncertainty. It will almost never look as beautiful as here, right? You could just go the staircase down, but that's at least the intention. And in order to get there, what we do is we run experiments, and then we inspect them, and then we adapt based on that. So if you look at design thinking as one approach to do this, or Scrum as another framework to use here, you can see all of those things. We plan, that's the sprint planning. We do daily scrums where we basically inspect and adapt, like mini inspect and adapt events. Then we do the review, which is related to the what, and we do the retro, which is related to the how. So everything we do in terms of these agile frameworks, tools, and techniques is ultimately with the intention to frequently and systematically reduce the uncertainty, both in terms of what and how. Now, when we talk about empowerment, I'm going back to that word, empowerment is not a means to an end, to itself, right? It's a means to an end. Why do we want empowerment? And Jimmy already talked about this. We want faster decisions. So think about this, right? Frequently reducing uncertainty. So we need faster decisions. And hopefully we get better decisions. Why do we get better decisions? Hopefully, because the people who are empowered, which is always a decentralization of decision-making, are closer to the customer and the necessary information to make a better decision than someone up the chain that has actually no interactions with customers and and so on, right? So that's the intention of empowerment. But empowerment has or requires some things that need to be in place. And I'm going to share a few stories around that so that you can take those stories with you, that hopefully you will remember those stories, and then dive into what I always think as more important, which is enablement. And the first story is a story of my son. My son is now 8 years old. At the beginning of the pandemic, he just turned 6. So in April 2020, he had just turned 6. And what I used to do prior to the pandemic was, I mentioned earlier, I was traveling quite a lot, going to different clients. And what I always liked was to stay in hotels. And I never opted for those luxury hotels, but I liked those like boutique hotels which had a certain character. And in each of those hotels where I stayed, I looked for inspiration in terms of how can you design your bathroom? How can you design like this? What kind of covers can you use for, like, I just looked for inspiration. I love interior design. I'm not particularly good at it, but I'm interested in it. So when the pandemic hit, no more hotels, no more inspiration for Sohrab. So what I started to do on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, I looked at houses that were for sale. My intention was never to buy a new house. I just called up the realtor. I went to that house. I had a look. I got some inspiration on what kind of changes can we make to our own house. And on one of those occasions, I took my son with me. Now, I didn't share the context with him. Why am I going there? He just wanted to spend time with me. So we went there together. The moment we enter the garden, right, my son just does a quick scan. He sees that they have a pool in that house. We don't have a swimming pool at our house. He asks the realtor, even before he says hi, he says, how much is that house? The realtor says 3 million euros, and my son says, I'll buy it. Now, what do we do? Do I empower my son to take this decision? Obviously, no, right? It doesn't make sense. I share this story quite a lot. And last time I asked the audience, like, what would have happened if I had empowered my son? Someone wrote back in the chat, like, you would have a pool now. And obviously I would have, but I would also have 3 million euros less, which I don't have. So this means I would have a ton of debt. Now, the reason I wouldn't empower my son is very simple. He is not capable of taking that decision. So whenever we think about empowerment, we need the ability to take good decisions first. Now, my question to you, what does need to be in place in order to take good decisions? What needs to be there so that we as leaders can empower people? So information transparency, knowledge about the context, data. Okay, I agree with all of that. What else? Motivation. Someone wrote seniority. Sandra, I would be interested by what you mean with seniority. So maybe you can elaborate on that. Understanding the problem, which is different from knowing the context, right? It's also the ability to analytically dive into something. We need the skills, absolutely, right? So in the case of the house, someone would need to be able to, knowing the context, let's say my family wants to buy a new house. Part of the context is to know how many bedrooms do we need, etc. But you also need to have the skills to understand, okay, if we pay 3 million, how much can we get from the bank? At what interest can we get that? How many years do we have to pay that back? Like, what is our current cash flow as a family? Like, how does all of that make? So you need a ton of things to be in place before someone can be empowered to make that decision, right? I also bring up another thing. In many cases, so with my kid, it was obvious. He doesn't have the capability. But in many organizations, we just expect people, to bring up one example, to be able to work in Scrum without ever going through a training, a coaching, or whatever. It can't be that difficult, right? That's what we expect. Now, what I've also done in my life is I've been a trainer for young people in terms of both soccer and basketball. And I've observed this countless of times. If you have a group of 5-year-old kids and you tell them play soccer, in our case in Germany would say play football, what do? Does whatever they do look like soccer, look like football? Not at all. Why? They don't know the rules of the game. They don't have any technical ability yet, like how to pass the ball, how to shoot the ball, how to like stop the ball. They don't understand anything about tactics, let alone about strategy. And it's very clear to everyone that we first need to teach them in order to get a result that looks like a good football match, right? That's very clear. Now, in most organizations that I work with, yes, they do have learning and development. They do have HR. They do have some kind of education catalog in there. But honestly, with regards to many of the skills that people need, there is very little there, both in terms of options that people have and budget that people are allowed to use in order to become better. But that's not the case for every profession. So I mentioned earlier, my career started out as a medical doctor. Now, in medicine, in Germany, you go through 6 years at least of university. And it's usually some of the brightest kids that enter med school. I think that's across the globe. Now, what happens after 6 years of med school? Are you done learning? Are the organizations done teaching you? No. That's actually when it starts. So when you enter residency or a fellowship or whatever you want to call this, in Germany, in order to become a surgeon, you need another 6 years of training. As part of this training, you're doing work, obviously, but there is always someone watching you. And by that, I don't mean like Big Brother way watching you, but there's always someone there who is helping you to learn how to cut, right? It's not like just taking a knife and cutting. There is a certain technique, like where to cut, which type of scalpel to use, etc. They teach you how to stitch. They teach you how to do sutures. All of this is taught. Plus, you're still learning like techniques. You're still learning about anatomy. You're still learning about physiology. You'll learn about radiology. All of those things you're still learning. Now, another 6 years have passed. Now you're a surgeon. Are you done learning? No. There's something called CME, Continuous Medical Education. And every medical doctor, as far as I'm concerned, all over the world, needs to demonstrate a certain amount of education hours, even if they are a board-certified surgeon, cardiologist, whatever. That's how they keep their license valid. Now, if you compare this to the corporate world, you don't have that everywhere. Now, you can say, because there are no requirements in order to keep your license, that's why we don't have that. But again, there are exceptions. So my second career was in management consulting. In my first 2 years at Bain, I mean, we have to admit it because I was also not a non-business hire, I spent around 30 days, 30 days on trainings. There was the new consultant training, there was the associated consulting training. I had a special training for non-business hires. I got some training for learning how to work with Excel and PowerPoint, because for me as a medical doctor, Excel was the green program, PowerPoint was the red program. That was, of course, not sufficient to be a good management consultant. But there was a lot of emphasis on helping me, enabling me to become the consultant that I could become. Many organizations don't do that. So from the world of medicine, I've taken one thing with me, and that has always worked for me, both as someone who wanted to learn and still wants to learn, but also now being in my own company, having employees, etc., and previously having managerial positions, as someone who teaches others. And that's a simple concept called see one, do one, teach one. Usually it's more than one, especially when it comes to surgery. It's usually like 100 of those things, because otherwise the patient wouldn't be safe. But it's super simple. You have to observe other people doing it. You have to do stuff under other people's supervision. And once you become a master at something, you also have the obligation to teach others. That needs to be a basic concept in any organization that wants to do this. Because guess what? Systematically and frequently reducing uncertainty equals building up knowledge or creating knowledge. Those of you who have done maybe a bit of research and know some history about the Agile movement, there's a very famous paper written by two Japanese scientists, Takeuchi and Nonaka. And that paper is called the New Product Development Game. Ultimately, from that paper, they created a book. It's very dry to read it, but if you have the patience, it's a good read. And that book is called The Knowledge Creating Company. Ooh, right? All of that is about how we create knowledge. Now, knowledge can be created through experimentation. That's what scientists do. But knowledge can also be created and shared through interpersonal relations. from the manager to their employees, between peers. It can also go from below to above, right? That's how knowledge needs to transfer throughout the whole organization. Now, when we go back to the concept of empowerment, there is another chart that I want to share with you. One of the companies that is known for a very radical and a very successful culture, at least for many years now, has been Netflix. And I think Jimmy talked about that as well. At Netflix, they don't have a culture of autonomy. They have a culture which specifically says of freedom and responsibility. So you can always think about, okay, this is responsibility. And responsibility is, again, based on skills that you have. And the more responsibility people are willing to take, the more freedom you can give. And what you want is ultimately end up in this type of corridor. Because if you give more freedom than people are willing to take responsibility for, that's not good. If you give less responsibility, or if you give less freedom than people are able to take responsibility for, they feel micromanaged. That's not good either. You want to be in this channel. Similar to flow, right? You want to be in this channel. And you always, as a manager, but also as someone who is being managed, need to look at this. This can be the foundation or the basis of a great conversation, where one person says, hey, I am capable of doing this, so let me run with this. One of you had earlier asked Jimmy, so how do we convince managers to get out of the way? One way is you just talk to them and tell them what you're capable of dealing with. And I have yet to see the manager that sees that someone can actually do something at a really, really high quality and does not want to get out of their way. You know why? Because almost every single manager, including myself, we have other things to do. And every time we micromanage, we are taking our capacity, our brain power, our creativity from doing something else, and instead we're doing something that for most of us would probably be boring. So this is one way to demonstrate that. On the other hand, you can also say, I appreciate the freedom that you're giving me, but honestly, I lack the context. I probably lack the skills to do this, right? I need more help. So ask for that help, right? Get that manager involved. Tell them, I need to see this a few more times. Then I need to do this a few more times under your supervision. And then I'm good. And I can actually then teach it to others. But have that honest conversation between yourself and that manager. So how do we enable people? We talked about it. We need skills, right? David Marquette calls this or refers to this as competence. We need context. Again, David Marquette refers to this with a different term, clarity. And I believe what we also need is courage. Because even if people have competence and clarity, if they lack courage, they're probably not going to do well with being empowered. So this also needs to be in place, and we will talk about what is the foundation of that courage. But let's start with the competence, with the skills piece first. Most organizations, especially when it comes to the area of Agile and Scrum and whatever, they're like, all right, so we need to enable our people. Sohrab, we get that, right? We need to teach them how Scrum works. Let's do a Scrum course. Can you do that? 2-day? Can you also certify them? Yep, I can. Is it going to be sufficient? Most likely not. Why not? Because there is this concept of the forgetting curve. Maybe you've heard of that. So if we look at the time, and here, the knowledge that sticks, the forgetting curve looks like something like that. After 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the paper that you read, 80 to 90% of the things that people learned in the 2-day certified class gets lost if they don't use it, right? Why does it get lost? A, because you can only jam so much knowledge into people's brains within 2 days, right? I mean, you can cover a ton of slides. I did a workshop, or I co-facilitated a workshop with one of the creators of Scrum. We had 234 slides in 2 days. Now, who can remember that? Even I, as a very experienced trainer, was lost after those 2 days, right? I didn't have any recollection what we covered when. It just passed by. It was fun. It was interactive. There were great stories in there, but I don't know how much of that knowledge really sticked with the people. No, it was not Ken Rubin. Ken is not the inventor of Scrum. There are actually 2 people. You can read it in the Scrum Guide. Now, but within those 2, I'll leave it up to you to think about who that was. So the concept of the forgetting curve, really, really, really important. The second thing is, any training is still a simulation. We can do some Scrum simulations, building cities with Lego. All of that is great. It's still a simulation. Now imagine, would you trust your life with a pilot that has been through a 2-day simulation, flying a plane? Probably you wouldn't. Now, applying something like Scrum correctly is not a matter of life or death, but I think it proves the point that 2 days of a simulation is not enough. It doesn't mean that it's irrelevant. I mean, there's a reason why I do this, and for me, it's never been making money. It's always been, I try to maximize the impact that I have. And you do see people where you make a difference. And even if those 10 to 20% stick with the people for a longer period of time, that is a difference. But can we do better? I believe we can. And one thing that we have created over the past 3 to 5 years, and it really became to full fruition during the COVID period, is the following. You can look at a initial, let's say, 2-day training, whatever, as some kind of a kickoff of a journey. But it really needs to be a journey, right? So then you need to have that arrow, because only through that you get sustainability. Now, what else is part of that journey? After that initial thing, I distinguish between 2 things. Things that are owned by the person who is doing the learning, and things that are at least need to be owned by the org, or at least need to be supported by the organization. So after 2 days, what can the learner individually do? One thing they can do is they can pick up some kind of self-paced online course, which they go back to as a reference all the time, right? That's why we spend so much time and energy and money in creating our self-paced online courses, so that people can use them as a reference. And as it is our philosophy to create a sustainable journey, if you buy the course, you get a lifetime license. Because again, if you lose your access after 1 year, it's not very sustainable. You can look at the learning curve again, or forgetting curve again. 2 weeks later, 4 weeks later, you forgot a lot of the things, although you had access to an online course. You can also read books. I am, and you can see this based on what I have in my background, I'm a huge fan of books. There's so much stuff I've learned from books. There are stories in books. There are concepts in books. There are reflection questions in books. There's a ton of stuff out there. And if you're looking for a great book in terms of like becoming a Scrum Master or product owner, there are a ton of books out there. 2 books that I always recommend, and you can easily remember their names, are Scrum Mastery and Product Mastery. Both are written by my colleague, Jeff Watts. So trainer colleague, we don't own a shared company, but we consider ourselves colleagues. Now, what else can you do? The next thing anybody can do is you can get some of those reflection questions and sit down and answer those questions for yourself. Like, look at your context. How does what you have just learned apply to your context? Where are you deviating from what the model actually says? Where does it make sense? And where can you do better? Where do you need to apply more rigor, more discipline, and so on and so forth? So do this. And the final thing that easily people can do, and it doesn't cost anything, create some kind of small cohort of people where you share things with each other on a regular basis. So just having that every other week appointment for an hour, where 3 people come together, it holds you accountable like a book club to read a certain number of pages in the book, or do a certain number of modules in your online course or whatever. B, you get to get different perspectives. Because you read something, you interpret it in one way. Someone else reads it, they interpret it in a different way. And these small cohorts, they can be within a company. They can be across various companies. There are no boundaries to that. As long as you keep confidential information confidential, I think there's no organization that would have any problem with this. And the good thing is, other than maybe an online course, all others are basically free. I mean, honestly, books don't cost much, right? Most books don't cost much. So they can be done. And that is really up to the learner whether they want to do this or not. And a lot of people take not having a budget for learning as an excuse. And I always tell them, don't. Because even if you don't get this, through all of this or parts of this, you're going to make meaningful progress. Now let's get to the second piece. Where do you need the organization to get involved? And why do I believe the organization needs to be involved? Because there are certain things that are within your circle of control. Probably you're familiar with the concept from Stephen Covey. Other things are only in your circle of influence, but you can always influence them. So as an organization, in order to accelerate people's learning, help them become better at what they do, you can, instead of an initial 2-day workshop, or on top of that, you can have additional workshops, right? Where a trainer comes, maybe from the outside, that shares some insights with people. But again, don't forget about the forgetting curve. You can do some individual coaching, right? Where they talk to each other, where one individual, see one, do one, teach one, gets coached by someone else. Could be someone from the outside. You see, the emphasis is on could, and I'll get back to that in a moment. You can have some inspirational talks, right? Someone comes in, gives a keynote, or people can attend a conference like you are doing right now. And ultimately, you can create some kinds of communities of practice where a ton of these cohorts get together in a structured way within an organization, or again, across organizational boundaries. And through that, more and more learning happens. So you see, there are a ton of, again, sometimes even free things that organizations can do, such as a community of practice, or almost free, which accelerates people learning, which accelerates the enablement. Now, another thing that I am now trying to establish more and more within organizations is to look at this and say, how much of this can we do ourselves? And how much of this do we have to outsource or get other people in? And honestly, other than the inspirational talks, where you actually want some kind of outside perspective, everything else can be internalized. And I think that's something that organizations need to do. And some organizations used to do that, maybe are still doing that, and that made them very successful. My favorite example here is Intel. The second or third CEO at Intel was Andy Grove. Andy Grove, famous also for creating the OKR method as an extension of the management by objectives initially created by Peter Drucker. And Andy Grove was not only CEO at Intel, to a large extent, he led, listen to this, he led the management and leadership development programs at Intel. And by that, I don't mean conceptually, yes, that as well, but he gave courses himself. There are videos on the internet where you can see Andy Grove teaching other Intel leadership members or managers OKRs. So those are not sessions where he tells them what their OKRs are. He's actually teaching them the concept. Now, how many managers, be it middle managers, be it top managers, in organizations do that today? Not enough. I'm not going to say zero because there are exceptions, but it's not enough. It's not even on the manager's plate that this could be something which they can do in order to deliver value to the organization. And now go back to some other professions that I gave as examples earlier. Who does the medical education of students and fellows and residents? Is it HR or L&D? They coordinate it, but it's other doctors teaching doctors, right? Who trains pilots? It's easy, right? It's other pilots teaching pilots. If you look at any other craft, like electricians or carpenters, it's always the master of that craft teaching the student who wants to become a master at some point. But somehow, when we talk about management and leadership and Scrum mastership and it's other people doing this instead of the people that are already doing the job, and in many cases doing the job successfully. Because we don't believe that this would be a value add to the organization. And I think that definitely needs to change. So we want the organization not to only coordinate this, but we want the organization to own this. And as part of our own company philosophy, we try everything in our power to convince our clients to not only embark on this sustainable enablement journey, but to also say more and more of these elements we want to take over, because only then it becomes sustainable. I've been now in the consulting business for 15 plus years. And what I've always seen, every time there was a downturn, and now a bigger one is approaching probably, the first budget that gets cut is consultants and coaches and trainers and whatever. Now, if all of this is delivered by external people and the budget is cut, none of this is going to happen any longer. But if you've created the structures, if you've built up the capabilities that you can run this internally, then it becomes truly sustainable, right? So this is the first aspect of enablement, is teaching the skills. The second is the context, the clarity. Some of you had mentioned we need the data, right? That people can actually then, based on data and knowing what the strategy is, take decisions. I want to share another story. It's almost now 8 or 9 years ago. I was working with an insurance company, not that big, around 5,000 employees. And they had initially brought us in to deal with the traffic jam, that's the analogy that they used, in their project portfolio. And as part of that, we ran a few sessions, etc. And one of the sessions, I still remember it really well, was I was presenting what Agile actually means to the CEO and his peers, right? So C-level. And as part of that, I was also teaching them about one way of working in an Agile way, which was Scrum. I always start with the 3 roles, the product owner, Scrum master, and the developers. And while I was talking about the product owner and the product owner's responsibility being what do we build and in which order do we build it, so prioritization, one of the C-level members raised their hand. Oh, yeah, go ahead. He's like, I love this concept of a product owner, right? It sounds really entrepreneurial and someone is going to take accountability and we're going to have fast decisions. But now I became curious, it's not going to work at our company. So the medical doctor in me, trying to drill it down to the diagnosis. Why? Because our product owners don't know what our strategy is. And if they don't know what our strategy is, they cannot take the right decisions. I'm like, yeah, that's a good observation. Now, why don't they know what your strategy is? Because we don't share the strategy with them. Okay, so why don't you share it with them? Because we only share it with C-level and the 1 level below that. Okay, why do you have that policy? Because we're afraid that our strategy leaks, right? And then our competitors know what we want to do. It's valid, right? It's a valid logic. So my response to him, you have a choice to make. I agree with you. Under the current circumstance, your product owners won't be able to make the right decisions. They can make guesses, and some of those guesses might turn out to be correct and others not, but they're not going to be able to systematically and frequently reduce uncertainty based on informed decisions that they make. I'm not going to tell you which way to go, but you are right. If we want to do Scrum, that policy needs to change. Fortunately, they decided to change it, and then they put their product owners in the position to make those necessary changes, right? So information transparency, providing the data, all of that, in many cases, is based on the internal policies that we have in organizations. And if you are someone that wants to be empowered, but for example, you lack the necessary information to be able to make good decisions, you have to ask for that. Most likely, you won't be able to change the policy yourself. It's not within your circle of control, but it's definitely, within your circle of influence. So you can highlight the same way that I did that, what the implications are if you are not given that data, or if someone else is not given that information. They won't be able to make good decisions. They won't be able to make quick decisions. So your organization won't be able to frequently and systematically reduce uncertainty. So that's the second piece. That's the clarity or the context piece. The third piece, in terms of enablement, in addition to providing like a sustainable learning journey or enablement journey and providing the information, is courage. Now, courage is a big word. And courage, we cannot immediately create courage. We can't ask people to be courageous. I mean, we can do it. Will they be courageous? Probably not. And if I remember Jimmy's talk from earlier, he talked about this concept of psychological safety. Now, this is, again, a big topic, and we can do 3 days of training around this, but I try to break it down into one flip chart, into one slide. And psychological safety is not that it's either there or it's not. Similar to anything else, there is some gray in between. And there is actually a journey an organization can take. Now, that journey, and for that, I'm going to use a model, and I'm slightly adapting it for the sake of this, for the sake of this talk, is from Tim Clark. So if you're interested in learning more about that model or in general about psychological safety, go to people like Tim Clark, Amy Edmondson, Adam Grant, Brené Brown. There's a ton of good literature out there. You see, I'm a big fan of books, but that model is fairly simple, and I like to explain it. So what Tim Clark first says, there is a stage called exclusion. Most likely when people feel excluded, they also don't feel psychologically safe, right? Now, in order to get people to really contribute to your organization, we're not talking about innovation yet. We're talking about like normal contribution and starting the journey towards feeling safe. The very first step is that you need to create inclusion. People need to know that they belong to where they are. That can be done by showing a genuine interest in who that person is beyond their skills. It can be in frequently telling them and showing them that they are a valuable member to that team. There can be a lot of things. So inclusion is the very first step. The second step, and this is why I like this model so much, it's about learner. And in order to learn, people need to first, so inclusion safety, learner safety. In order to learn, people need to feel safe to admit that there are certain things they can't do, right? That's when they ask for being able to learn. And they need to be open to learning from others, which means they need to have a certain level of trust towards others, be it an external trainer, be it someone internal, ideally, who has done this job maybe earlier or maybe before that. The next step, once you get to learner safety, and you actually cannot skip any of these, at least according to this model, is contributor safety. So now that you feel included, now that you have learned you do feel some kind of safety that you can actually contribute, and that gives you a good feeling, right? And it's also good for the organization that you are contributing. And based on that contributor safety, you get people to the state of challenger safety. And this is, according to Tim Clark, the threshold for innovation. Because when people start challenging the status quo, be it in terms of the product, in terms of the processes, in terms of the management principles that we use, whatever the customer groups that we serve, then innovation can happen. But you need to get people there. And that usually takes a lot of time. But the important thing is, on all three aspects, competence, so building the right skills, clarity, providing the context, and courage, creating an environment of rewarded vulnerability or psychological safety, as Tim Clark defines it, on all of those things, one can work. Some can be influenced directly or be controlled. Others can be influenced, but there's nothing that is completely outside of our sphere of influence, be it middle managers, be it top managers, be it regular employees. And I don't mean this in any way bad, right? Anyone can influence these kind of things. Anyone can start to make a change here. Now, to close this, I mentioned earlier Netflix, of them having a culture of freedom and responsibility. Netflix is also known for moving away from this pyramid structure where you have the CEO at the top, where informations go up and decisions go down, which results in the organizations usually being slower, and moving from here to a model that they illustrate as a tree, where the CEO actually is down here, where you have the SVPs here, and where you have the decision makers up there. Now, guess what? What do they call their decision makers? What do they call the people up there? They call them informed captains. This is very important. Both words have a deep meaning. I talked to one of the engineering managers at Netflix earlier this year, Kate Wardine, and we talked about this concept, informed captains. Why informed captains? Because they do have the necessary information, which is the context and the clarity. Where does the ship need to go? And they do have the expertise that a captain has and the courage that a captain has to make those decisions. And in order to get to these informed captains, it's not enough to just break this and say from tomorrow on, we're like this. It's actually helping every single one of these, and it's not one informed captain, it's actually thousands of informed captains. It's to help every single one of them that we want to act as informed captains. We need to enable them to become better decision makers through helping them build up the skills, providing them with the context, and also creating an environment where they do have the courage, which is also a personal characteristic, but an environment can support that, of making the decisions. All right, that's it from me. We still have around 10 to 12 minutes for any types of questions that you have. I'm happy to answer them. And Michael, I would ask you to moderate that or facilitate that if there are any questions.
Absolutely, yes. Please drop questions into the chat box. I saw some comments, but I haven't seen questions yet. So please share.
So informed captain is not the same as a knowledge worker. Knowledge worker, everyone doing like not manual labor is considered a knowledge worker, at least based on the definition of Peter Drucker, who I think was one of the first people to coin this term. But an informed captain is actually a decision maker, right? An accountant is a knowledge worker. Do they make a lot of decisions? Probably not, right? But an informed captain, at least in the case of Netflix, are people that sometimes take multi-million-dollar decisions because they do have the information, they do have the skills, and they do have the courage. I hope that was helpful, Siadis. Other questions? Is it possible to combine the two? So the knowledge worker and the, absolutely. I mean, most informed captains would be knowledge workers, right? The accountant becoming someone who helps create budgets, etc., could, or approving a budget, could be an informed captain then. So knowledge work in many cases is part of the skill set that people need in order to be able to be informed captains. But that's not all the skills they need. We need more than university teaches us. Always take the example of a medical doctor. 6 years of med school, another 6 years of becoming a great surgeon. That happens after med school. What do we have? Are the informed captains managers or individual? Many of them are individual contributors. Mm-hmm. So if you're more interested about reading about or learning about Netflix, there's this book written by the CEO, which is Reed Hastings, and Aaron Meyer, a professor at INSEAD Business School in Paris. It's called No Rules, Rules. If one of you can look it up on Amazon and just post the link in here, I highly appreciate it. It's a great book. It was published 2020 or 2021. It's amazing. It's a big eye-opener in terms of moving towards a culture of freedom and responsibility. And you will see this didn't occur overnight at Netflix. It took a lot of commitment and a lot of time to get there. And that initial commitment was there. Why? Because the CEO, Reed Hastings, had created or had founded an organization earlier where they added a ton of like policies here and processes there. And to quote him, he said, at some point we had an organization that was so dummy-proof that only dummies wanted to work there. And he didn't want this to be the fate of Netflix. He wanted to actually create something else. And with his chief people officer, a lady called, I forgot her name. This is so bad because, but she wrote a book. That book is called Powerful. And with her together, they basically created or set up the foundations for this culture to emerge, because you can't create a culture. You can just set up the foundations. Yeah, No Rules, No Rules is there. What else? Do you have something like a simple step-by-step guide how to implement such a culture of empowered growing people in the old existing corporate? A very simple one. Yes, I do. No, just kidding. So what I really recommend to organizations, and it's been landing really well with some of our clients, and they're doing, is to think about education or enablement really as something long-term, right? To move away or beyond the initial 2 days. I'm not saying this is bad, right? But this is not sufficient. Accepting that this is not sufficient and that people need more, and then there is a lot of options that don't cost anything, and then there are some other smart things that you can include as an organization, and that you as an organization can not only take ownership for the coordination, but also have more of your managers becoming the teachers in this space. That is new for most of those organizations. And this takes a lot of change, but I truly believe that it will make a huge difference. And there are organizations, like I mentioned about Intel, that did this many, many years ago. And it worked for them. What else is out there? How can we effectively advise the lack of information? One way is to have that conversation that I did with one of the C-level people at that insurance company. Ask them what is going to be the implication if we have the lack of information. There might be good reasons behind it. Again, right? In that case, the logic was valid. But if you aim for something else, which is more entrepreneurship and more decentralized decision-making, then that policy might not make sense any longer. So having that conversation, open and honest, right? Not coming across as like, oh, we know it all and it needs to be like this. Nothing needs to be a certain way. It always depends on what kind of results you want to achieve. It's about diet, it's about exercise, and it's the same about organizational structures. Depending on what you want to achieve, there are better or worse practices, and lack of information or transparent knowledge is not the right thing for every organization or for every outcome that people want to have. So talk to them, show the implications, and have an honest conversation about it. That would be my advice. can you speak to helping the org management understand that they are part of the change as well versus fix the teams? Oh, absolutely. This is one of the most important things that we usually tell organizations that we start working with. If your leadership team is not committed to going on such a journey themselves, there's probably no point in even getting started. I really believe that. And it really doesn't matter what you're doing. It doesn't matter if you're going to do what kind of scaling framework. It doesn't matter. None of that matters. If the leadership team is not willing to go on such a journey themselves, everything else is going to be completely irrelevant. So we are actually becoming bolder in terms of asking our clients commitment as part of the prerequisite for us working with them, right? To what extent is the CEO willing to do this? Now, in a few weeks, I ran a whole bunch of leadership workshops for one of the biggest retail companies here in Europe, around 30 billion in revenue. Now, in a few weeks, I have a meeting with their top 8 people where we're going to do exactly that, right? Help them embark on a journey to become better leaders. They are great at what they're doing. But with the direction that the organization wants to take, they also have to learn new things. Because otherwise the organization would have already taken those necessary steps. They haven't. So they are very well aware of that. They, as the top management, also need to embark on this journey.
You know, Sohrab, something I'm picking out of this, I really like this slide you had here, this drawing you've got, because it is that additional, I need to be able to go back on a regular basis to look back at materials and learn and remember what I learned a month or two back, and it's good to have the interactions. We have our communities of practice, you know, Scrum Masters and product owners and developers and such. And so I've actually thrown a question out to our coaching team, in my company, do we have a manager COP, community of practice, where we can learn, where managers can learn and share stories and learn about how they're working to enable their teams and what's working and what's not. And I think that's very helpful. I think we're going to need something like that, because you mentioned it. We don't come to this knowing how to do it, right? Managers, and we need to learn how to do this in this new way. And questions that people are having about the toxic environments, I like to try to show that we're having successes and what do they gain from it? What can they see as a plus? And can we pull the product management, the leadership into our circle and start to be excited about what we're doing and how they can take something out of that and gain from that, right? How can they work with us?
Yeah.
And it's a new way to work for many people.
Absolutely. And I mean, why wouldn't we have a community of practice for leaders? Why not? Right? Are they the only ones that don't have to learn? Are they the only ones who don't have anything to share, right? Are they the only ones who can't make any progress? If we have something for Scrum Masters, if we have something for our Java developers, if we have something for our quality engineers, we need something for our managers, for our leaders as well, right? For me, this is like completely clear that we need to, but I agree with you, like very few organizations do have that. So there are many options out there. And there's another question here. Everything starts with leadership and managers in organization who help and observe them in the second 6 year, like doctors, to be masters in developing organizational culture. It's again, those that are more experienced. And wherever you see that you lack a certain skill to train this or teach this internally, of course you can go outside and do it. So my brother-in-law, he is a neuroradiologist. And he learned everything he could learn from his chief of the department in the University Hospital of Cologne. Now, after that, he wanted to continue. And his boss had the awareness that in the direction that my brother-in-law wanted to continue, his boss couldn't help him. So what did the boss do? He told them, hey, I have a few friends in different university hospitals. You can go on like 1 day, 2 day, 1 week, even rotations, and learn from them and come back, right? or you can get someone else that can teach you this. But the important is that we as organizations understand that agility and learning are the same thing. Learning about our customers' desires, learning about how to build the products, learning about what the process should be, like how to build from technology perspective and the process on how to collaborate. All of that is learning, and that learning happens on the job, but it also happens through these kind of things. And through this, we can accelerate it, right? That's something that we need to learn. It's not about the 2-day class, right? But there's so much more out there. So with that said, it's 1:15. I think, Michael, we are at the end of our time box.
Yes.
Thanks for hosting.
Sohrab. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. And thank you very much for the questions and participation, everybody. Well done.
Thank you, everyone.
We're
Have
going to
a
take
good
15
rest of
minute-
the conference.
Yes. Thank you, Sohrab.